Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of For What It's Worth with myself, Ben Hager, and we got Dominic here this month. Topic is planning. It's May, so the good thing is the weather's improving. We're all starting to come out of hibernation. It's that time of year. But what else comes with the month of May is National 529 Day. So May 29th, really built around the idea of encouraging families, saving for college, building awareness, all the things that come along with getting ready for college. Naturally, Dominic, I just kind of think of where I'm at in my life with our kids, and I got a ways till this conversation starts, but it feels like it'd be really a daunting task to think of, where do I start? What do I do first? When do I do it? So Dominic, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can start us down the path of talking about college as we begin to prepare for that path early in life and throughout our child's timeline.
Yeah, no, thanks, man. I appreciate it, especially for someone like you when you have three kids coming all together when you go to college. I mean, that's a big cost to bear, especially if you want to help them out. So today we're going to be using JP Morgan Chase's College Planning Essentials. So we're just going to go ahead and use their slides to kind of illustrate some of the things that are important to us. So as we start to go through it, you may have remembered that we had a previous conversation with Aaron last year who really helps walk people and their families on what you should do while you're in high school, how to prepare, how to best navigate the system, because the academic aid world is changing. It will continue to change, and getting some help can definitely assist you during that with what schools to choose. And here's a college preparation timeline, because it feels like you have to start sooner and sooner getting prepared for college. And you see here that there's a lot of different things with exams and the different dates. So if that is of interest, you would want to reach out with Aaron. He is very helpful. But it does seem like we're starting to get earlier and earlier, as a junior, to start to really think a lot more forward about it. College is getting more and more expensive. We all know that. When you look at comparisons of the tuition versus other expenses, up almost 900% since 1983. We hear people talk about that as jokes, that they used to be able to pay it off just paychecks, being able to get through school with a part-time job and have no debt. Obviously, that is not the case today. So costs are going up by a lot, and it is quite expensive. But on the other side, aid since 2013 has not been increasing as much. So it's getting more specific on merit versus academic and needs based, but the expected help is not really helping here. So when you look at some of these stats with families now paying 80 or 48%, excuse me, of college expenses from income investments, if these costs are going up, it has to come from somewhere. So having that plan really is important. All right. So with financial aid not increasing as much as the actual costs are, the financial aid eligibility seems to continue getting more and more complex, with more of those bills getting put onto the parents or the students. So it is quite complex as you're going through it, wanting to make sure that we have eyes wide open to it.
I think this really speaks, Dominic, right? As you move forward to the next slide here, I think this really speaks to the idea of that initial timeline of starting so much sooner, or working with someone like the gentleman you had on the recording back in the fall, because having a guide to get you through this. I mean, there's so many layers to this. Rules have changed. I think of it all the time when I'm chatting with a family and they have a college student entering college, even down to how student loans work. It was different than when I went to school. When I went to school, they were handing out student loans like it was going out of style. I mean, if you wanted to go, it was up to you, and you could go. They'd give you all the loans they want. Well, a lot of those rules have changed now. So I think it really speaks to that timeline and the fact that there's a lot of preparation here. This isn't sit for your ACTs or SATs your senior year and apply to a couple of colleges and you're off and running and you're going to figure it out. There's quite a bit of a lead time here. And I think some families are getting there, but I would say I probably couldn't emphasize that timeline enough on the front end of at least starting by your junior year. And I know I've heard some families starting even sooner than that, or when they're working like with a coach, starting sometimes even in their freshman year, of kind of making a gradual process instead of all of a sudden, and it's a shock to the system and it takes a lot of time and effort to come to a good conclusion.
Yeah, they allow 18-year-olds to sign their lives away. When you see some of these charts about how expensive it's getting, today just for a public in-state, 107,000 of a total bill. That's just for in-state. Granted, you start to apply with the complexities of each school and their merit aid and the different aids that they have going on. So really trying to have your eyes open to this is important, kind of thinking about it as a family. Because when you see these kinds of bills starting to stack up as it goes further and further out, having that philosophy on how you want to be prepared to help your children in the future bear this burden really will help go a long way, because it starts to help you think through how can we put ourselves in a position to save for a big bill like this. It's similar to retirement. You don't just pay for it all in one go. You got to start to make these small changes throughout the time to be prepared. Even if it is you want to do 50% of some of these bills, having that plan really starts to walk you through it. So being crystal clear there really helps.
And I think that speaks, Dominic, wouldn't you agree that that speaks to a conversation that we have a lot with families, and it's really around kind of their values, right? And their values of really putting in an order of priority how important is education and how do they view education, not just from, yeah, I want my kids to be educated, but what's the priority or what's the value around how we're going to fund that. Some people are like, look, I had to take on debt to get myself through school. I expect my kid to do the same. Some are, I had to take on debt and I hated that experience. I don't want that for my kid, right? Everybody's situation, I think, is going to be a little bit different. But having that values conversation up front is something that we encourage. That's between, families to start to have that open dialogue. And then we're here to guide you along the way of having that conversation of, all right, so you don't want your kid to walk out of school with any debt. That's great. Now we got to figure out how to do it right. Because as we can see, it's not a cheap proposition.
Yeah. And if you plan for certain things, but it goes unexpected, like you had planned for 4 years, but it goes to 5 or 6, or higher education beyond just your undergraduate degree, how are we going to think about that as a family? Because these costs really do add up, and they have to come from somewhere. That's why, there are grants out there, there is scholarships. It's hard to bank on that and plan for it. So we do want to have some wiggle room, because when you start to look at things like the loan programs, a lot of people think that there's unlimited loans that you can get through these federal programs. But you can see here on the right side that the annual loan limits aren't as big as you would think, especially on the subsidized and unsubsidized loans, where you can get some advantages while they're in school. We've seen a lot of people have to do things like the Direct Plus loans, where you're just getting loans out and they're going to continue to increase and get bigger while they're in school, which obviously you don't want to happen, but that's just what happens here. So interest rates aren't as well. We want to make sure that we're planning for those types of things.
Yeah, those dollar limits for loans, 3,500 to 5,500 a year. Gosh, I would suspect that's barely paying for meal plans for some schools.
Yeah, that's barely anything when you start to really add these up. But those aren't indexing compared to what the actual college costs are. So we've just seen from time and time again, it really helps putting the small amounts away today to even out that liability, letting those investment earnings help you pay for college versus the other way around of having to borrow and pay that interest against it. So just really getting ahead of it tends to help. So a
So it
lot
kind
of
of feels like, Dominic, right? It kind of feels like, hey, me as a parent, I'm going to have if my intention is to see my kid go on to higher education of some form, I'm going to have a monthly payment in one way or the other. It's either I can see it as a monthly payment that I'm saving in to an account for my kid's future education, or it's a monthly payment in the form of debt in the future. One way or the other, there's money coming out of my paycheck, let's say, to plan for this or to pay for it, right? It's either are we doing it now and we're harnessing compound interest to our benefit, or we're doing it later and compound interest is hurting us, right?
Yeah, 100%. This helps spread out that liability, because as your children get older, you tend to get closer and closer to retirement. So you start to think about yourself, making sure. I mean, we all have the demands of the world trying to take our dollars. So just really getting ahead of it tends to help. Because a lot of times people tend to think only of like 529s here. They do have tax advantages. I'd say one of the biggest is that tax deferral of compounding of those earnings. Is you're not going to pay taxes from the day you start it all the way until that you need the funds. They are tax free once you take them out and use them for qualified education. And they have continued to open up the realms of how they can be used, such as these amounts to where you can use it for pre college for tuition in private
Yeah, I
school.
just had that conversation with a family that they're looking at sending their kids to private school all the way through from kindergarten on, and they're looking at this and saying, "Well, that's an opportunity there, right?"
Yeah, yeah. And so it does help. But when you look at it, we think about the tax deduction. That's always in the news. It is not quite as impactful as you think. And you see states like Ohio, they are what's called a tax parity state, to where you can get a state deduction for contributions you make up to the limit of 4,000. But that can be for any state's plan. So you do get the deductions, and it doesn't just have to be Ohio.
And I
So
think
we,
that's important just to address. I mean, we have a lot of very specific conversations with families around this topic. And if you have interest, obviously we could have that one-on-one conversation. But I think it's important to point out because it's a common misconception. If I use the state of Ohio plan, does my kid have to go to a state of Ohio school? No, right? And that's not unique to Ohio. We could use a Virginia plan, a Washington plan. You can use any state's plan, and that is a unique benefit of the state of Ohio. But even if you're in a different state, let's say Illinois, right? One of the ones that doesn't have this tax parity item, it doesn't change anything as far as your ability to use those funds for any state school. It's just a matter of are you going to get a tax benefit on the front end?
exactly, exactly. So a lot of people actually, when you look at the stats, use this cash savings checking CDs to pay for college, which is quite staggering. We do believe in a split approach, which is a combination of putting enough money into a 529 to hit some rough goals, but still giving yourself flexibility to save outside of the 529s to make sure that you have that flexibility if something were to happen. So for me, when I look at the stats here, it's so surprising that 50% of families pay just using cash. I mean, just think about that over time from the compounding state. You
I
need
think
your,
that's where that would be my biggest concern is are we really harnessing the power of making our money work for ourselves? It feels like this is a much more near-term goal than maybe retirement as an example. But the reality is, whether you start planning from the day your kid's born or not, okay, so maybe it's not an 18-year type time horizon or an 18-year goal. Even if your child's 8 and then you have that discussion or start to work towards saving for college, it's still a 10-year timeline. And if we stack rank asset classes on any 10-year rolling time frame, there's not many times where cash is winning that 10-year timeline. I would say almost zero, right? So the reality is I think there does have to be a balance there of understanding your own ability to take on risk and comfort with risk, right? So not everybody in every family is going to be equal, but I think it's understanding what that risk looks like. What's your timeline for investing for this specific goal? And could we get our money to work harder for us? And again, take a bite with the earnings power of the dollars you're saving, take a bite out of the effort that it takes to get an education funded, right?
yeah, yeah. And this, as you're thinking about it as a family, how much flexibility do we want? Because it's hard to plan for your children when they're young. You don't know exactly what they want to do. So we've seen a
Yeah.
lot of success in people save outside the 529, even though it won't get that tax deferral, which is very advantageous. But at least if something were to happen, you've earmarked these separate funds just for college. And if they go to use it or you need to use it prior to college, there's no tax penalties. So you do have to pay taxes along the way, but that's just part of it. But it does give you that flexibility. So I do think it's always something that we want to think about is how much flexibility and comfort do we want to have with these. So when we're thinking through our goals, it's very important for us to segregate these goals. Because if we start having mixed matching things and the accounting starts to get lost and it's hard to keep progress, making sure we're keeping track to it. Or, for example, here, if you have to use retirement funds, you're going to have
Yeah.
taxes and penalties and withdrawals. And it's just hard when a lot of things are jumbled up together for it to be clear in your mind on, am I on track for this? Retirement, college, and being prepared to really having good accounting and earmarked goals and accounts really helps out.
Yeah, and that's where on that last slide, you don't need to flip back there, but on that last slide, there's a decent percentage of families that were utilizing 1K plans, individual retirement accounts to fund college. And, look, I get it. Life happens and sometimes you just need to do what you need to do to make it through. But obviously, our hope and our job here in planning is to avoid the necessity to dip into these plans that would jeopardize a different goal, which is your retirement. Something I share with families all the time is, no shortchanging your kids or anything, but the reality is they've got a lifetime to earn money to if they need to pay off a student loan or to make money on their own. But if you're approaching your retirement timeline, there's no taking loans in retirement, right?
No, I think it's such a good point when you're thinking about it, because there are ways to do it. It's just at what cost is it gonna come? So really bearing that cost today starts to help. So here's just some easy illustrations on savings. If you started to save today for someone, what would you need to save to hit those goals? So like $500 a month can get you saved up to, let's say, 200,000 if we're using round numbers. But that difference of the compounding of those 6 years, when you look in the middle of the graph, of almost 87,000 of a difference, just because of those first 6 years were a big difference. So this, you see the compounding, it really has effects, whether it's within the 529 account or outside of it. So here's just some measurements. I think it's always good to just keep in place in your mind of, if I'm trying to hit goals from just around rule of thumb numbers, what should I be hitting to get there? Because when you start to see here for a public college in state with those total costs for someone at the age of 15, if I were to save for it today, that's about $3,000 a month. Pretty sure we want to spread out that liability and start to save today and really put that compounding to work for us. So a lot of times people say, hey, I can't do that today, or how can I really start to add up these funds? Well, I'm sure the kids won't like it, but it's good Christmas gifts. It's good to add up to, and it really will make a difference. Here's just a sample of doing regular investments, if a refund or job bonuses, but really as you start to get additional cash, always making sure it's allocating towards the goals that are important to us.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of families do that over the years where a grandparent specifically is usually where I see it happen the most. Instead of buying them, five toys or all these different things that ultimately are, going to lose their appeal and use over time, is maybe doing a couple of things but then putting some money into the 529s. I've seen families do that every year on a birthday. And again, if that's something that is of interest to you, let's continue that conversation. But I think that can be a great resource, is kind of getting a family effort behind this as the expense just continues to grow.
Yeah, that's where a common concern that we get is, what if we put too much money into a 529? Had great benefits. We're able to take funds out tax free, assuming it was used for qualified education expenses. Well, because of this same scenario that continues to hit families that have oversaved in 529s, they have opened up what you could start to use those funds for. Now, for example, here, Roth IRAs, you're allowed to start using those 529 plans that are left over for the benefit of the beneficiary and make Roth IRA conversions to that Roth without paying any taxes. It is subject to the annual limits, so they do have to have earned income, but you can get up to a max of 35,000 into those Roth IRAs, stretched out year by year at that 7,000 max, how it currently is today. So this is not something we're trying to do, but it really is a good backdoor approach if we have additional funds. Because something to always keep in mind is, if you have leftover funds, they can always be transferred within family members to someone else or another sibling. You can easily change those beneficiaries. But if we're still stuck with that, we can make these Roth IRA contributions and help them out. So it's something that we always want to make sure we're talking about with people, because it comes up a lot. There's a lot of different ways on how to attack these savings plans and how to deal with these bills. But that's why it's really important for us to talk through, what's important to the family, how do you expect to help, and what would you like it to look like over time?
Yeah. And I assume you would agree with this statement, Dominic, but I mean, the reality is we're just scratching the surface here. I mean, the idea is to bring awareness to an important topic. It's a growing expense. If education is a priority for your family, as I've heard you say many times, Dominic, right? We don't have to have a certain solve or all the same solve, but having a plan. is the most important thing. Everybody's plan is probably going to look a little bit different, but having a plan is the most important step. And yeah, I know that we could have much longer conversations here, but we got to wrap it up at some point. But I would say continuing this conversation, if this is something that is of importance to you, or again a grandparent, other family member, of saying how else could I help. Again, I think there's a lot of great conversations we could continue to have around this topic, but it's more than anything is just bringing awareness to the subject, right?
You're exactly right. So we've been talking about the savings. Now there's whole different conversations to talk about the decumulation and actually using those funds. I think that's where we can come into play and really help out.
Yep. All right. With that, Dominic, any last comments? Otherwise, we'll wrap up for the month of May.
I think that's it. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great month. We look forward to talking with you again here soon. Take care.